You're sitting in a stadium. 70,000 people are screaming. There's a ball on a grass field, 2 teams, a referee, rules so detailed they take up an entire rule book, sponsorships, merchandise, a broadcast deal worth billions, and somewhere in the crowd, someone is eating a lukewarm hot dog that cost them $14. This is modern football, and it feels utterly inevitable. Like, of course, humans ended up here. Of course, we built this. Of course, a ball, a field, and 2 teams is where we landed. But here's what nobody tells you. Before the stadiums, before the trophies, before the World Cup, before the $14 hot dog, humans were already doing this. Thousands of years ago, on different continents, with different balls, different courts, and in at least one case, consequences for losing that went considerably beyond a post-match interview where you say you gave 110%. The story of how ancient humans invented ball games is also the story of how they understood gods, death, the cosmos, and political power. And the fact that it all started with a bouncing ball is exactly why it's so strange. So let's go back, way back, because this rabbit hole goes deeper than you think. And once you understand what was actually happening inside those ancient courts, you'll never look at a penalty shootout the same way again. Here's what most people assume when they hear ancient ball game. They picture something kind of cute. Villagers kicking a round thing around a dirt field. Maybe some goalposts made of sticks. Basically just primitive football, before someone figured out the offside rule. That assumption is wrong in almost every direction. The ancient ball games that archaeologists have found weren't primitive warm-ups for modern sport. They were sophisticated, brutal, architecturally demanding. They could function as entertainment, sure, but also as religious ceremony, political theater, diplomatic negotiation. And in specific times and places, in specific cities, on specific sacred occasions, human sacrifice, all of those things, in the same court, at the same time. That's a sentence that should not be possible. And yet, here we are. Let's start at the beginning, or at least one of the beginnings, the FIFA Museum. And yes, the FIFA Museum is a real thing and it counts as a source. Credits the Chinese ball game cuju as the earliest documented football-like kicking game in history. The name literally means kickball. It's over 2,000 years old. People were kicking a ball around ancient China while Julius Caesar was still a toddler. The game had multiple versions. It had technique, it had style, and it's the ancestor most directly linked to what eventually becomes modern football. But cuju, as cool as it is, isn't the strange part of this story. Cuju is the sensible cousin, the one who shows up to family dinners, talks about their job, and leaves at a reasonable hour. The strange part of this story is on the other side of the planet, in Mesoamerica, where people had invented something that wasn't just a sport. It was a complete cosmological system, played with a rubber ball, inside a court shaped like the letter I, in front of crowds that bet heavily on the outcome, under the gaze of gods who had, according to the mythology, already played this exact game themselves. That's where we're going. And it starts with a ball. Around 3,400 years ago, maybe longer, the Olmec people of Mesoamerica were playing an organized team ball game. We know this because archaeologists have found the courts. Jeffrey P. Blomster and Victor E. Salazar Chavez published a paper in Science Advances in 2020 reporting the earliest known highland Mesoamerican ball court, found at Etlatongo in Oaxaca, dated to 1374 BC. That's not a rough estimate. That's a specific archaeological anchor. People were playing organized ball games in a purpose-built court in 1374 BC. For context, that's about 400 years before Homer is estimated to have composed the Iliad, and archaeologist Eric Taladoir, who spent decades cataloging these sites, reported having identified over 3,050 ball court locations with reasonable certainty across Mesoamerica and neighboring regions. 3,000 courts. Not a fringe activity, not a regional hobby, a civilization-wide institution, bigger in geographic scope than any single empire that used it. But none of those courts would exist without the technology that made the game possible. And that technology is the thing that blew European minds when they finally encountered it. The Mesoamerican ball bounced, and in the ancient world, that was basically magic. The ball was made from the sap of Castilla elastica, the local rubber tree, mixed with other plant materials and cooked until it solidified. The oldest known rubber balls were found at El Manatí, an Olmec ritual site, with some estimates dating them back to around 1600 BC. This is the earliest evidence of rubber ball technology anywhere on Earth. Europeans, at this point in history, had never seen anything like it. They had leather balls filled with air or stuffed with things. They didn't have solid bouncing rubber spheres that defied reasonable expectations about what round objects were supposed to do when you threw them at the ground. It just bounced, again and again. with what one European observer would later describe as an almost living energy. And here's where the technology becomes immediately relevant to your body, because the modern rubber ball you think of when you imagine a football weighs around 400 grams. The Mesoamerican rubber ball used in the traditional game ulama today weighs 3.2 kilograms. That's about 7 pounds. That's roughly 7 times heavier than a modern soccer ball. Players didn't kick it with their feet. They returned it with their hips, their shoulders, their thighs, the protected parts of the body. They wore thick belts and protective gear to absorb impacts from a 7-pound solid rubber object coming at them at speed. So when you've been winded by a ball in gym class and you thought that was bad, imagine being hip-checked by a cannonball for sport, in front of thousands of people, in a court you can't leave until someone wins. And the court itself was not just a field. The Mesoamerican ball court was shaped like a capital I, a long central alley flanked by sloping embankments or vertical walls with end zones at each side. They ranged from small local courts to enormous civic monuments. The Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza is about 168 meters long, longer than an American football field. And the acoustic design of some of these courts is so precise that you can stand at one end and hold a quiet conversation with someone at the other end without raising your voice. That's not an accident. These weren't just constructed spaces. They were engineered environments for a very specific kind of human performance. The game itself didn't have one universal rulebook. This is important. Eric Taladuar makes clear that the game had many versions that varied from village to village, region to region, era to era. The most common variant involved returning the ball using hips, shoulders, or thighs. No hands, no feet, no head. Scoring systems were complex and local. Some versions used a mallet, some used the forearm. The game the Olmec played in 1374 BC wasn't the same game the Maya played in 800 CE, which wasn't the same game the Aztec played when Cortez arrived. What held it all together wasn't a rulebook, it was meaning. The ball game was a ritual. And to understand what kind of ritual, you have to read the Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh is the Quiche Maya creation narrative, compiled in written form during the colonial period, but drawing on much older oral traditions. And at the center of it, at the absolute mythic heart of Maya cosmology, is a ball game. Here's the setup. The hero twins' father and uncle are serious ball players, dedicated guys, and the noise of their game, the constant thudding of that rubber ball echoing through the earth, disturbs the Lords of Death down in Xibalba, the underworld. The Lords of Death are essentially the original HOA board. Noise complaint filed. The 2 ball players get summoned to Xibalba. They go down. They lose. They're killed. One of their heads gets hung in a gourd tree as a trophy. So far so good, right? Charming folktale. But then the hero twins, the sons of one of those dead players, grow up. They also start playing ball. They're also incredibly loud about it. The Lords of Death summon them too. And here's where it gets strange. The twins descend to Xibalba, play the Lords of Death in the ball game, and they win. They defeat death itself in a rubber ball game, and when it's over, they rise into the sky and become the sun and the moon. That's not a sports story. That's the entire cosmic cycle, life, death, and resurrection, dramatized as a ball game between mortals and gods. So the court wasn't just a court. It was literally the gap between the living world and the dead one, and the ball, moving back and forth, obeying gravity, refusing to stop, was the sun, moving through the sky during the day, moving through the underworld at night. Every single match was a reenactment of that cycle. When the Maya built a ball court in a city center, they weren't building a stadium. They were building a space where humans could replay the foundational drama of the universe, where the movement of a rubber ball through the air stood in for the movement of the sun through the cosmos, which raises an obvious question. If the game was about life, death, and cosmic renewal, what happened to the losers? This is where the story gets complicated. And accuracy matters here, because the popular version is too simple, and also too good for clickbait writers to resist. The popular version says the losing team was sacrificed after every game, every match, every time, automatic execution. This makes for a dramatic headline. It's also almost certainly not how it worked most of the time. Think about it for a second. If every losing team died, you'd run out of players pretty fast. Sports franchises have bad enough recruitment problems without that particular retention issue. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, in its documentation of the ball game, confirms that human sacrifice was associated with the game, particularly decapitation, and that depictions of sacrifice appear across Mesoamerica connected to ball court imagery. But it also notes that historians still don't know exactly who was sacrificed, when, and how the sacrifice related to the game's outcome. Archaeologist and anthropologist Carlos Navarrete, cited in AP's reporting, said sacrifice happened only in specific periods in specific regions, and that most of the time, the ball game was a social event with spectators, excitement, and wagering. People yelling at the court, people losing money on the outcome. Basically, a really intense Tuesday afternoon. Eric Taladuar goes further, arguing that the majority of games probably didn't end in human sacrifice, and that Spanish colonial accounts may have deliberately darkened the picture to justify suppressing indigenous practices. In other words, some of what we think we know was shaped by people who had very strong reasons to make this civilization look as terrifying as possible. That's worth sitting with. But, and this is a significant but, the imagery carved into ballcourt walls tells a more complex story. At Chichen Itza, on the walls of the Great Ballcourt, there's a relief panel showing a ball player who's been decapitated. From his neck, instead of blood, sprout serpents and vegetation. Now, your first instinct is probably that this is a horror image, a warning, a trophy case of the defeated. But that's not what it means. This is a fertility symbol. The death is feeding something. You get serpents, you get plants. Because in Maya cosmology, that's what sacrifice does. It doesn't end things, it converts them. Energy in one form becomes energy in another form. You weren't being punished. You were being transformed. Your death was literally feeding the cycle that kept the sun moving, the crops growing, and the underworld from swallowing everything. That doesn't make it less terrifying to think about, but it makes it something other than what we'd call brutality. It was a transaction, a cosmic one, enacted in a court in front of everyone with a rubber ball as the instrument. At El Tajín in Veracruz, which had at least 17 ball courts, an extraordinary concentration even by Mesoamerican standards. The South ball court reliefs are even more direct. One panel shows two ball players cutting out the heart of a third, while a skeletal figure appears above them. According to World History Encyclopedia's documentation of El Tajín, these panels depict ritual scenes including human sacrifice as part of the ball game context. The FIFA Museum also notes that stelae from Aparicio show decapitated men dressed as ball players. So here's the honest picture, as best as archaeologists can reconstruct it. Not every game ended in death, but some did. Probably in specific sacred contexts, on specific ritual occasions, in specific cities during specific periods. Maybe winners, maybe losers, maybe captives dressed as players for the occasion. The scholarship is genuinely unresolved on several of those details, and it may stay unresolved, because most of what we have is stone, and stone doesn't explain context. What we know for certain is that the imagery was everywhere, that the association was real, and that the people participating understood the stakes, literal and cosmic, in a way that nobody at a modern stadium is being asked to reckon with. Now here's something that almost never makes it into the popular version of this story. The ball game wasn't only a religious ritual, it was also politics. Hardball politics, if you'll excuse the unavoidable pun. Eric Taladuar's research indicates that some ball games were used to resolve conflicts between large Maya cities as a substitute for war. Instead of sending armies, cities sent ball players. The game delivered a verdict, and because the game was sacred, because it was connected to divine will and cosmic order, that verdict was binding in a way a negotiated treaty might not be. The gods had decided, through a rubber ball, in a purpose-built court, with witnesses. You couldn't appeal that ruling. There was no replay review. Rulers could participate directly. The stakes of a single match could include territorial claims, tribute rights, or political alliances. By the time of the Aztec Empire, the ball court in Tenochtitlan was located in the sacred precinct right next to the Templo Mayor, the most important religious building in the entire imperial capital. Playing the game there, in that space, wasn't recreational. It was a declaration of power, a public performance of divine favor and imperial authority. The ballgame was, at once, sport, religion, diplomacy, and sometimes a verdict on who lived and who didn't. There's no modern institution that does all of those things simultaneously. We have sports, we have religion, we have courts of law. We keep them in separate buildings with separate dress codes. The ancient Mesoamerican ballgame refused those boundaries entirely. It was all of it, at the same time, in the same eye-shaped court. And that's the part that should genuinely unsettle you a little. Because the people who built and maintained that system, across dozens of cultures over thousands of years, believed it worked. They believed the game maintained cosmic order. They built their cities around it. They carved it into their most permanent surfaces. They played it through empire after empire after empire. And then, Hernán Cortés arrived, and he experienced it in a very specific way. When Cortés first encountered the Mesoamerican ballgame, his initial reaction was reportedly amazement. The game was spectacular. The players were athletic beyond anything Europeans had a framework for. But the thing that really got the Spanish observers, the thing that genuinely baffled them, that made them stop and stare and question their understanding of the physical world, was the ball. It bounced, not gently, dramatically, with a lifelike energy that solid balls simply weren't supposed to have. When Cortés eventually brought ball players with rubber balls back to perform for the court of Charles V, European observers were genuinely convinced there was something alive inside the ball because of the way it moved, because of the way it responded to impact and returned to shape and kept going, because nothing in all of European experience had behaved like that. An entire continent had separately invented both a sport and a foundational material technology, a bouncing rubber ball, something the whole old world had never made. But the moment didn't last. A P's reporting notes that the Spanish ultimately banned ulama and ordered the courts destroyed. The stated reasons were religious. According to researcher Emily Carrion, the Catholic Church concluded, and this is a direct quote, that the ball was the living devil. The game was too embedded in indigenous religion, too connected to ritual death, too resistant to the kind of surface-level conversion Spain was trying to implement. Courts were demolished, the tradition was suppressed, players were persecuted, the game went underground, literally, in some cases, surviving in remote communities far from colonial authority, in the mountains of Sinaloa, in the canyons of Nayarit, in places where Spanish administrators couldn't easily reach or didn't bother to look. And here's the part that should land differently now that you know all of this. The game survived. AP reports that ulama, the direct descendant of the ancient Mesoamerican ballgame, is still played today, mostly in remote areas of northwestern Mexico, and is now being actively revived. Around 1,000 people currently play it in Mexico and Guatemala, using the same hip return technique on courts that echo the ancient design. And with Mexico co-hosting the 2026 FIFA World Cup, cultural institutions are explicitly connecting the ancient game to the modern one, trying to bring public attention back to the sport that was played on this continent 3,000 years before a World Cup trophy existed. Think about what that lineage contains. A game born among the Olmec, spread across Mesoamerica through trade routes, migration, and empire, played in courts where the architecture itself was a theological argument, connected to myths about the origin of the sun and moon, associated in specific sacred moments with ritual death understood as cosmic transformation, banned by colonizers who thought the ball was literally possessed by a demon, surviving anyway, quietly, in remote fields, in communities that kept playing for centuries because the game meant something they weren't willing to give up. That's not a simple story of decline and revival. That's a story about what happens when meaning gets embedded deeply enough into a practice that no amount of official suppression can fully extract it. So go back to that stadium. 70,000 people, a ball on a field, the referee's whistle. Someone just scored and every single person in that stadium lost their mind at exactly the same moment. Thousands of people, strangers to each other, all feeling the same thing at the same time because a ball crossed a line. Remember that humans have been engineering that exact feeling for at least 3,400 years, the specific feeling of everything hinging on a single moment, a single ball, a single direction, the held breath, the explosion, the crowd becoming briefly, weirdly, one thing. Ancient Olmec spectators felt that. Maya nobility felt it. Aztec emperors felt it. Remote communities in Sinaloa kept feeling it even when playing was technically illegal and the courts had been torn down. The stakes have changed. The cosmic dimension has been largely outsourced to actual religion, which now happens in a separate building. The sacrifice is now metaphorical. Mostly. But the next time you're sitting in that stadium with your $14 hot dog, somehow cold and greasy simultaneously, which is its own kind of miracle, and the crowd erupts around you, just remember what you're actually participating in. A 3,400-year-old technology for making humans feel things together, invented by people who thought the movement of a rubber ball through the air was cosmologically significant, who built temples to play it in, who went to their deaths inside those courts and understood it as feeding the sun. The hot dog is new, everything else is ancient, and we still can't stop watching.